Hey guys, I've been gone for quite a while. I've been playing Path of Exile a ton in the past couple of weeks, which is what I've been doing. If any of you are curious, I know I always say I'm gonna make more videos now, but it's really hard to stay on schedule. When I don't even have that many games being submitted anyway. This one in particular was suggested to me by Mr. D Turtle. It was a seasonals game, as you can see, quarterfinals in seasonals EU between Spaiikz, Agigas. At the time, this was casted by Mogwai and Impetus. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Panda and has. I give up. And so here we are going to primarily be covering this from the perspective of Mr. Spaiikz, for the two reasons being that he is at the bottom, which makes it easier for both me guys to sympathize with and view from the perspective of the Spikecaster vision, and second, the reason being that I feel that there's a bit more to learn from this perspective, although we will at times discuss Agigas perspective a little bit. And so, as you can see, this is a game between Zoe Bai, based on the deck name. It was based on Ruben's deck, Ruben Zoo, and Puffcat Peddler, Emo, Ezreal, Hexcore Foundry with Frostbites, as you can see. And so these are the two decks in the game, and let's get into it. Now, I do want to say, as we watch the first few, that I think Spike's decisions were very, very logical. So now, first of all, these mulligans are interesting. The main thing is that this deck really, really wants to draw its Foundries. Puffcat Peddler is the main early game proponent in terms of engines. It's far superior to both Teemo and Ezreal, and that's why he kept it. But for the most part, he does want to find Foundry as fast as possible. That's the reason why he mulligan as hard as possible, despite keeping the very critical Puffcat Peddler. And the thing about Puffcat Peddler is that he's actually superior to a leveled Ezreal in the early game, because if you think about it, once you start putting in Shrooms early, if you expect your opponent to draw half of their deck by the end of the game, that means that, or between the time you plant the Shrooms and the end of the game, that means that for every 2 Shrooms you put in, you expect to deal damage. So if you expect your opponent to draw half of their deck from the point that of each spell you play while Puffcat Peddler's on the board, those spells are worth essentially 1.5 damage to your opponent's Nexus. That's just a rough estimate. The amount of cards you expect your opponent to draw will vary at the time, but as you can see, it is almost like having a leveled Ezreal that is also a 3/3 right from the start, which is incredibly, as you can imagine, useful. And so that's why Puffcat Peddler is so powerful to place right away. Now, the other detriment, of course, is that it can be difficult to efficiently play a lot of spells, because you will need to use most of your spells and hold a lot of mana to protect Puffcat Peddler. However, since your opponent will want to kill your Puffcat Peddlers, that will be overall not too big of a problem, aside from the fact that you may not have the Shrooms from Chumpwumps, for example, that you would want to play with your Puffcat Peddler, as that would require an additional investment of 6 mana, as well as having Puffcat Peddler, which you may not have. Now, in this position, as you could tell, Mr. Agigas had 3 decisions: Sump Dredger, Solari Priestess, and Open Attack. Now, he did discard, as you can see, Moonlight Affliction, which was pretty useless in this matchup, especially at this stage of the game. And as we mentioned, Spaiikz has primarily engine-based cards between Teemo, Puffcat Peddler, Ezreal, and spells. So, in fact, if Agigas were to play something slow like Open Attack or Solari Priestess, Spaiikz would be more than happy to play Ezreal and try to target the Mountain Goat with the Mystic Shot next round. And if they were to Hush block, you can always use a Flash Freeze or a Fury of the North, which we happen to have, save the Ezreal despite the Hush, and then essentially we waste the Hush, trick the combat, and we're completely happy, which is why Gigas is pressured to put on the heat for the game, and Sump Dredger does that fantastically well. the only possible way Spaiikz would have a good block, well, the only two possible ways would be to have an Iceveil Archer, which would be really, really good for Spaiikz in this position. It would block 7 damage for 2 mana. Very nice. Or to play another unit and Troll Chant. And in this position, that would be very restrictive and demanding of Spaiikz' hand, but because Spaiikz only has a Puffcat Peddler, Agigas succeeds in threatening 7 damage or killing Puffcat Peddler. So this tells Agigas that Spaiikz does not have A, Iceveil Archer, and B, Troll Chant, as you can see when Spaiikz does not take the block. Now, with the second Puffcat Peddler, we are in a very commanding position insofar as we don't take a damage. Now, because we have Troll Chant to trick these two combats, we are happy to attack. The thing about this deck, and protection spells in general, is that we want to use flash freezes to combat. We don't want to be blocking with a unit and then flash freezing other units, because that would be essentially going down in value for health. We are trading cards for health, and we're not in a position where we can afford to do that because we don't have Hexcore Foundry on the board. And even if we did, it would be unfavorable. So if possible, you would like to use flash freezes or frostbites or full chance to trade the kill your opponent's units using your Puffcat Peddlers as removal, basically. Using them as deal 3 damage and then using flash freeze to keep them alive. So basically, we get to turn our combat tricks into removal spells if we can get them to block, and more importantly, we aren't as threatened by wide boards, assuming we get to get their units off the board. If we were to not attack and they were to or we were to attack and they don't block and then they develop further units, we can no longer use our combat tricks as removal spells. As it is now, however, if they block and we use Troll Chant, we essentially are using it to remove 2 units and lessen the pressure on our Nexus by a lot. At 13 health, we are under a lot of pressure. Now, this attack tells Agigas that we have Troll Chant. In fact, you could even argue a case for not blocking, just to put on the pressure. However, because Agigas does not have that much damage on the board, it is not particularly impressive of a play in order to not any blocks, but it is worth consideration, and I'm not 100% sure if blocking was the correct choice. Now, Troll Chant versus Flash Freeze was a very interesting discussion there. I think that Flash Freeze has a lot of merits, some of them including including the fact that you prevent the gem, you get the same result for Flash Freeze, you have a replacement Flash Freeze. However, the downsides are also numerous. You spend 1 extra mana ahead of time when you don't need to. What were the other benefits? You use the card that your opponent knows you had, so that your opponent doesn't know you have the Flash Freeze. If we played Flash Freeze, our opponent would still know we have the Troll Chant because we attacked like that, and among other things. Now, critically in this game, because of this Harsh Winds top deck, it so happens that the upsides of Troll Chant come into play clear as day. Had we played Flash Freeze, we would only have 5 mana this turn, and it would be of tremendous harm to us, as we would no longer be able to save both of our Puffcat Peddlers, which would be very unfortunate. Now, our opponent plays the Warrior, which makes this turn extremely easy. It couldn't be a cleaner Harsh Winds. You get to use it to trick 2 combats, essentially use it as 2 Get Exciteds on their units, and also save your Puffcat Peddlers. It simply could not be better. This is the easiest turn I've ever seen. And in fact, up to this point, it could be said that Spaiikz has played perfectly. There was nothing that I would change. However, in this position, you are in the driver's seat. You want to be using your spells as combat tricks, and you want to be holding onto your mana for that. You want your opponent to take the initiative to spend their mana and for you to react. You don't want to be spending your mana prematurely. For example, if you were to attack now, then use a flash freeze when they block, then they can hush and they would have the initiative because we spent the mana first, which would put us behind. And that's why this pass is simply excellent. Now here they played Zoe, which is rather amusing. Now, they discarded one of the gems with their Spaiikz Sketcher, which leaves them with 1 gem left. As you can see here, their warrior has 2 health right now, but we can even assume that it effectively has 3 health. This means that with any tricks, one of their 2 Pale Cascades, one of their one of Guiding Touch, they could very simply use these 2 options in order to trick the combat. Now, in this position, I actually think 10 mana next turn. I think how I am in this position, I'm not 100% sure what I would do. Now, here's the thing. I think this looks like a very clean Static Shock. However, I think Spaiikz Sketcher is simply irrelevant. I think that you could even consider saving it to also hit the Serpent. I mean, they're only burning 1 less mana than you. I almost like passing as well. I even slightly prefer using the Static Shock on the Warrior just so that it's harder for them to save the Warrior in any combats or in any form of the fighting on the stack. I don't like this Static Shock that much. I think you either pass or use it on the Warrior, which is marginally, I think, very marginally better. I think you're happy to block the 1/1 with one of your peddlers without using any combat tricks. Whereas with the gem, I just think that I just think you want to make it a little bit harder for them to trick with the Warrior. You could say that it makes it a bit more vulnerable to Star Shaping, but I think that they want to save Star Shaping for their Nexus because at the end of the day, our main win condition involves a lot of burn. I'm not the biggest fan of this Static Shock. Now in this position, we see that next turn we will have 9 mana. But if we assume that we need 4 or 5 mana for the 3 Sisters to be played, that means that we have 2 combat tricks that would require 7 to 8 mana. Which means that even if we play Teemo, we will be able to play both Flash Freeze as well as 3 relatively safely. On the other hand, if we were to not play Teemo, give all of our mana, I think that's actually good too. The thing is that we are scared of burn. For example, they could play a gem on the Weasel, which would make it rather annoying as we would take 4 damage instead of 3. At 9 health, I think it's relatively safe, despite the fact that they run Subperissables, Get Excited, and Mystic Shots, simply because we know that they don't have much burn in their hand, or else they most likely would have used some measure of Mystic Shots, and maybe even Get Excited on our Puffcat Peddlers by now. Which is why I think we can safely say that they don't have much burn in their hand, if any, and playing Teemo for the elusive blocker is not necessarily mandatory, but I think it is a very sound play. You can always choose not to block with the Teemo if they open attack, but I think the fact that they would have to open attack for it to matter means that I'm not particularly inclined to play Teemo in this position, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Now in this position, however, I think that this is the first time that Mr. Spaiikz made a critical blunder. I absolutely don't think Ezreal was the correct play. Now, there was 2 other options. The first of which is using Mystic Shot directly on the Warrior before they can use the gem, and forcing them to have either Pale Cascade or their one of Guiding Touch, or finally their Star Shaping. In the case of Star Shaping, I think we're happy with that, as it would spend 5 of their remaining mana, leave the Warrior at 3 health, allowing to be finished off with our Puffcat Peddler when we freeze it, and also what happens would be that our Puffcat Peddler, they wouldn't be able to hush off the flash freeze as they would have 2 mana remaining. Overall, the problem is that because we played Teemo last turn, we only have 9 mana, which means we can't 8 mana instead of 9 mana, which means we can only play 2 combat tricks. However, by playing Ezreal, we not only limit ourselves to having only 2 combat tricks, we have 2 anyway, but it limits us to using Mystic Shot and Flash Freeze, but also gives them an extra target, whereas if we play Ezreal a turn later, he is guaranteed to have 2 turns worth of triggers. Of course, the problem being that we don't have so many spells. However, I think that given that we have the 3 Sisters, and the Flash Freeze, the Mystic Shot, of which we will retain 1, we get a top deck, we get 2 top decks actually, plus the Veteran Investigator. I think I would be more than happy to hold the Ezreal for 1 more turn, not be so proactive with this boy, especially since we know they have the gem. I think this is the first clear blunder in this game by Spaiikz, whereas I think up to now all of his plays were very logical, very sound. I don't think any of them could even be described as a distinct mistake. But I don't think there was sufficient reason to play the Ezreal at this stage. Now, Teemo is never really going to connect, so I think this block is perfectly fine. And again, if we simply hold our mana and protect our Puffcat Peddlers, even if they pull it, Puffcat Peddler is the kind where the earlier you play it, the more damage it does. And once you reach late enough in the game, Puffcat Peddler Shuffling Shrooms doesn't do as much damage as Ezreal, so you want to finish it off with the Ezreal. So we want to keep leaving our job to Puffcat Peddlers for as long as possible and keep Ezreal for the finisher. This is a very inefficient usage of our resources at hand. The other thing is that I think I would be happy to, if we were to not play the Ezreal, would be to use the 3 Sisters over the Flash Freeze in this turn, that we can get in 12 Shrooms with our Puffcat Peddlers, and then worry about Ezreal using the Flash Freezes and so on, where not only is it guaranteed to deal 2 damage, but also the fact that we would be spending our mana investments while we have the mana. Because later on, during a critical turn, our mana may be tight and we would reserve our more mana efficient Flash Freeze. Now, as I said here, this is this deck really relies on its Hexcore Foundries, which is why this draw is pretty unfortunate. And as you can see, Spaiikz is very distinctly running out of value, which means every point of damage is going to matter from this point. Now, the other thing is that because there's so few Hextech Foundries, the expected draws for the rest of the game is much lower, meaning that the expected value of each shuffle for Puffcat Peddler is going to depreciate very quickly, because the game is going to end within a few turns at this rate, and the number of expected draws, is very few. So each spell we play is going to be expected to deal probably less than 1 damage per Puffcat Peddler, which would be unfortunate. Now, here, as I said, every point of damage matters, so he really wants to trade this in for damage. So he plans to cash in this board effect, essentially, for damage. And our opponent, with their iterative improvement, very logically uses 4 mana to block 6 damage. Now, as I said, if we were to save our Ezreal in this position, and we had a Flash Freeze, and instead we would have shuffled in a bunch more Shrooms earlier, 6 more to be exact, several turns earlier, while our Puffcat Peddlers were around, we would have given them more opportunities to draw these Shrooms as well. And then we can worry about, the burst damage while having an Ezreal in hand. So this Equinox, you could say, is rather bad by Agigas, but the thing is, he has to do it because Spaiikz doesn't have to attack. anymore. If you were to have two Puffcat Peddlers, you would be a lot less inclined to cash in this attack. And Agigas would have to deal with two Puffcat Peddlers, and he has no threat of damage for a distinct amount of time. And there would be a lot of top decks for Spaiikz that could turn this south for him. So he wants to be able to kill off the Puffcat Peddlers, and additionally, because he can choose his blocks, he knows that he wants to block with the 0-2. He can kill off the unsilenced Peddler and essentially get rid of both Peddlers by forcing Spaiikz to attack and take 3 damage. Now, it is, for the record, the 2 Peddlers are most likely would have done more than 3 damage. Now, here's the other thing. If we go back just a little bit, as you can, actually, I don't even need to. As you can see, Agigas uses Icefield Archer on the 3-2, and you could say there's 2 things. So first of all, when you freeze a unit with Icefield Archer, the target you pick is the unit you do not want to block. And obviously you want to block Puffcat Peddlers, and that's the reason he froze a non-Puffcat Peddler unit. Now, between the Veteran Investigator and the Icefield Archer, which one would you rather block? And I would say that the reason he picked the Investigator over the Icefield Archer, I am honestly not certain. I think using the Icefield Archer on the other Icefield Archer would have been better. I think freezing the Icefield Archer would have made the most sense, because this is the unit that you least want to block. But for all intents and purposes, the 3-2s and the 3-1s make more or less no difference. Now, the Trickster managed to trade off for 2 Teemos, which is as much as you can ask for. And on the other hand, both Peddlers are gone, and he is at 7 health with no board presence against 3 units with tons of Shrooms in his deck, low life, and the only unit in his hand is Subpermissible, which draws a card. Agigas is in, quite frankly, dire straits. And so as he looks for the only ways to get on board right now, Iterative Improvement happens to be the only one, and obviously takes not only the highest added one, but also the one that does not draw him a card. The benefits, of course, being twofold. Now, in this position, he should not have used Star Shaping first. He could have simply bluffed the mana and then used the Star Shaping after combat, because it could affect Spaiikz blocks. Now, in this position, from Spaiikz' perspective, I think this is a distinct decision that must be made. Now, you have essentially 2 options. 3. So you can take a block and then play Chump Wump and play your 2 Shrooms. Your second option is to block with Fury of the North, kill off their blocker, and open attack with 4 units. Or rather, to set up an open attack with 4 units versus an empty board. And the other option is to tank 4 damage and play Chump Pump and 2 Shrooms. Now, I think it is readily apparent that our opponent has little to no burn. Which is why I personally, if we were to use all of the information at our disposal, would prefer we tank the damage, play Chump Pump, 2 Shrooms to guarantee lethal, and say that our opponent must have, well, a ton of burn. Whether it's us top decking 1 Shroom, which is incredibly unlikely, and them having 2 Get Exciteds, or more likely a Get Excited, a Mystic Shot, and a Get Excited or a Mystic Shot, which is also very unlikely given the course of the game. That's why I think you should tank all of this damage and attack with Chump Wump after playing the Shrooms. Now, it is very hard to make this decision knowing your opponent has 3 Mystic Shots and 2 Get Exciteds in their deck, so I personally don't find it surprising at all that we choose to block. Now, if we do choose to block, we have the option to, well, play Fury of the North to remove their blocker, or we have the option to leave them with a 4-1 and play the Chump Wump and 2 Shrooms, or we can use Flash Freeze and then play Chump Wump and not play the Shrooms. So let's talk about our pros and cons. If we were to kill the Puffcat Peddler, then we would have 4 attackers, and they would have no blockers. that would be pretty enticing. However, because all of our units have essentially very similar attack, even if we give them a blocker, at most they can block the new developed unit, which is Chumpwump, which means that what would happen is that we are essentially attacking to their 0 attackers. It would essentially be the exact same thing should we play the Chumpwump and have our full board. In this scenario, there is no benefit to playing Fury of the North. In the second option, we have Flash Freeze to prevent the damage, but in exchange for not playing the 10 Shrooms. This would be relatively safer in terms of preventing lethal, but it reduces our chances of getting lethal next turn. And so this would be much more equal. You don't really swing in the extremes of either direction. And finally, the option would be to take one block, develop Chumpwump, and rely on the Shrooms to be much more for lethal. Now, I don't like this option either because, well, to be frank, I think 3 damage on the Nexus is far superior to putting in 10 Shrooms this turn instead of next turn. And so we come down to essentially 2 options. Well, 3 options. So we would play tank 4 damage and play Chumpwump, or we would tank 0 damage, play Chumpwump, 2 Shrooms, and finally we would actually, yeah. So I think those are the main 2 options I would prefer. I don't like the Flash Freeze option. Actually, no. I meant I like the Flash Freeze option. I don't like the give you up 1 unit to play 2 Shrooms option. So it's either Flash Freeze plus Chumpwump or tank damage plus Chumpwump. I don't think we go for the Fury of the North in this scenario. Those are the reasons why. Now, I do understand the appeal of giving your opponent an empty board. It just so happens that in this scenario, your opponent having an empty board, or rather removing your opponent's last unit, it has the exact same effect as developing a new unit with 4 attack. Or in this scenario, even 3 attack. If we develop any unit with 3 or more attack, then removing their blocker does the exact same thing as developing the Chumpwump, which is why I really do not like that play. However, intuitively, by practices, it is something that we have built up instinctually that making your opponent's board empty to set up the open attack is usually a very good practice. However, it just so happens that unfortunately for Spaiikz in this position, Agigas deck does not benefit from having an extra blocker outside of in any way that would outvalue you having an extra attacker. And again, for that same reason, in this position, we should actually develop. The main downside to developing would be if they were to iterative improvement one of our Ice Veil archers to block more damage. However, at the end of the day, if they do that, they're committing 4 mana. Our opponent has a limited amount of mana to both have slow speed and fast speed actions, or more precisely, development punishes and open attack punishes to balance or to counteract our development options. With only 10 mana, it doesn't matter if they have development options because that will limit their overall mana for this round. And that's why Chumpwump plus playing all of your units this turn would have been superior. And with that, we conclude the game in daring fashion as everything comes down to the most minuscule of probabilities, as everything hangs on a thread. Neither player has any more control over the outcome of the game, as Agigas uses the last of his 3 mana to reduce his Shrooms by 6, so that he has the maximum probability of drawing to his outs, which is a good play. And in fact, he does not top deck the 1 Shroom that is needed in the 1 card. And you could say that both players were unlucky. Agigas did. While Spaiikz had no Hexcore Foundries, he did have a tremendously overwhelming advantage over the board as soon as Agigas blocked with the Mountain Goat on round 4, I believe. And also, Agigas was not very lucky in terms of his own effects, where he could not threaten Spaiiksz's health with it or peddlers with any form of burn. So you could say that this was a very back and forth game, very intense, a lot of critical decisions. I think both players played very well. But I think that there was definitely room to improve, things to learn. But I will readily admit that both players played better than I would have in their situation. But I hope that this was educational to you. Thank you for watching. This was much, much longer than I had planned it to be. If you've made it through the whole 30 minutes, you are an excellent viewer, and I hope you enjoyed. Have a good day.